If you encounter a triangle that isn't a right angled triangle, then you need to be thinking about either the sine rule or the cosine rule. And using the sine rule depends on you knowing at least one angle and the length of the side opposite that angle. In other words, you need an opposite pair of information. If the triangle doesn't qualify for the sine rule, then it's the cosine rule you need. In the first triangle, I know an angle and I know the length of the side opposite. So I have an opposite pair of information, so I can use the sine rule. In the second triangle, I know an angle, but not the length of the opposite side. I know a length, but not the value of the opposite angle. And again, I know this length, but not the value of the opposite angle. I can't make an opposite pair, so I can't use the sine rule. So having decided it's the sine rule I'll be using for this triangle, since I have this opposite pair of information, the first step is to write down both versions of the sine rule. And it's easy to see one is just a flipped version of the other. Step 3, we're going to label the triangle. Now remember, lengths are lowercase, whereas angles are uppercase letters. But always start by labeling the side or angle you've been asked to find. We're asked to find this side here, so we'll label this A, and consequently the opposite angle will be uppercase A. Doesn't matter which side we now turn our attention to, but it's just going to be a little easier when it comes to solving the equation if you choose the side and angle that gives you the information. So we'll call this side B, and consequently uppercase B for the angle, and that just leaves this side C and uppercase C. Now, since the unknown we're asked to find is a length, and hence lowercase a, it's this version of the formula that we're going to use, since lowercase a is on top. This is just to make it a little easier when solving the equation later. So using our diagram, we'll substitute our known values into this version of the equation or formula. We'll only ever use two of these three fractions. So always keep the fraction that contains the unknown you're being asked to find. And always pick the fraction that contains both values. You can dispense with the other one. Finally, we'll solve the equation. If your algebra is secure, you'll have no difficulty. And if you can't follow what I'm doing here, look at my other videos on how to solve equations. But the notable thing about this equation is that the unknown is part of a fraction. Deal with this by multiplying every term in the equation by the denominator of the fraction. These cancel out on the left, and you can just enter this into your calculator. Here's another triangle. This time we're asked to find an unknown angle. I can see that we know an angle and its opposite length, so it qualifies for the sine rule. I write down both versions of the sine rule. I label the triangle. It's important you always start with the unknown you are asked to find and label it A. In this case, since it's an angle, it's uppercase A, and the opposite length will consequently be lowercase a. I'll label this angle B and the opposite side lowercase b, and that leaves me with this angle C and the opposite length lowercase c. The unknown is an angle and hence capital A, so I'll choose this version of the formula since the capital A is on top. I'm going to use my diagram to substitute the values into this formula. Again, I only ever choose two of the fractions in the formula. Always pick the fraction containing the unknown and the fraction that contains all the information. You can just delete the other remaining fraction. Finally, we solve the equation, and just as before, we notice the unknown is part of a fraction. And the way to deal with this is to look at the denominator and multiply every term by this denominator. The left cancels out and you are left with this. You should know from your work with right-angled triangles, when we need to find an unknown angle, we'll use the inverse sine function. In other words, the shift sign button on your calculator. And you'll enter this into your calculator so it looks like this. So here we have the 5 steps I suggest for using the sine rule. First of all, you need to know that it is indeed the sine rule that you're going to be using, and that giveaway is that an angle and its opposite length will be known. Step 2, write down both versions of the sine rule. You're setting yourself up to get this question right by doing this. Label the triangle starting with the side or angle you've been asked to find. Choose the appropriate version of the sine rule with the unknown on top, and then substitute in your known values. And finally solve the equation.